Okay, let's get started on the next session. Let's shift from infrastructure, environment, and growth to now the macro picture. And in this next section, we'll have three speakers. Derek Scissors from the American Enterprise Institute will start out, followed by Yiyao Bi from the Chinese National Development and Reform Commission. And the session will be rounded out by Shambaugh from GW. And I ask that we keep the questions towards the end of the session. And let me give the floor now to Derek Scissors.
Thanks. I'm going to preface my remarks by saying that I've been highly agitated for the past 11 months. You can guess why. I'm highly agitated today. Please don't take it personally, unless you want to. My thesis is easy. China is well on its way to stagnating economically and is running out of time to avert that. Disclaimer, which people get confused about, I am not arguing that China's headed for a crisis. Its financial system is nothing like the American financial system, and arguments that it reminds people of laymen and just they don't make any sense. That is not my argument. I'm arguing for stagnation. And then the premise. The premise is that, and people are going to disagree with this, we know what makes economies grow. Individual economic rights and commercial competition are what make economies grow. And contra very much to the idea that China is different, it's a new model, China's own experience is very strong evidence of the fact that it is individual economic rights and competition that make economies grow. All right, so that's the foundation of the argument that China is stagnating. So I need to give you a little history. Probably everybody in the room knows this, but it'll have my stylized facts version of it. The foundation of China's economic success is granting more property rights to farmers in 1977, 1978, and 1979, capitalizing that by granting property rights within special economic zones. Then after the Tiananmen-inspired break, you have a wave of reform that was about rights to own urban housing and commercial competition such that smaller SOEs were allowed to fail. So I characterize the two waves of Chinese reform, the 78 wave and the 92 wave, as being about property rights, different kinds of property rights, and competition. That's what worked for 25 years, made China much, much better off in 2003 than it was in 1978. Now there's some debate over when things started changing, including people who don't think it's changed. Anywhere from 2003 to 2008, on net, progress towards greater individual economic rights and greater competition stops. You have patches of reform, but the right side becomes less impressive and the competition side, in fact, in my opinion, deteriorates. If you read the plenary communiques in 78 and 93 versus the ones in 2003 and 2013, it's clear as day. 78 and 93 are radical changes, and 2003 and 2013 are, let's make sure that the state remains preeminent. So that's my history. China was reforming for 25 years, it was very successful. You might say 30. I'm not arguing the 25 years. We have left the reform era, we left it before the financial crisis, and China has suffered for it. Let's try to document that. I hate using GDP per capita since it doesn't exist. Try to spend your GDP per capita if you think I'm wrong. Disposable income, according to the Chinese government last year, so it's their figure, not mine, per capita was $3,600. The closest US figure in terms of structure was $42,100 or $400, I can't remember. So we can all very much agree that China has a very long way to go to be rich. If you want to use GDP, official GDP growth in 2017 will be less than half of what it was in 2007. So we can also agree that the trend line is very clear for Chinese growth. If you want to use private wealth, which I prefer to use, but most people don't, in 2005, 2006, Credit Suisse has Chinese private wealth rising about 30%. In 2015, 2016, it shrank due to capital outflow, I think, although they don't document that. So again, we have a dramatic change in Chinese economic performance over the past 10 years. Not mild, not a gradual slowdown. The party loves smoothing its statistics. Those are highly misleading. All right, that's actually the good news. The debt measurement is the bad news. To be nice and use GDP instead of wealth, nominal GDP rises mid-2007 to mid-2017 on an annualized basis by $8 trillion. M2, broad money stock, rises $19 trillion. US M2 GDP ratio in 2016 is 0.7 to 1, and China it's 3 times higher than that, and the gap is widening. Now, you may not have noticed that the United States is an under-leveraged, underfunded society, that we're dying from too much lack of money creation. And yet, China, with a different financial system, is 3 times more leveraged according to M2, and the gap is widening. And that second part is key because the differences in the financial systems were supposed to get less, and they are becoming more. It's not because China is becoming healthier financially that that's occurring. Rapidly growing, slowing growth, rapidly increasing debt. Everybody here in this room knows about Chinese aging as a strain on human capital contribution. You have a depleted resource endowment. There is no floor below which China cannot go. You can't say, well, China used to grow fast. I just can't imagine China growing less than 4% or whatever in terms of GDP terms. That's not the way economics works. If I gave you a sheet of paper and took out all the size numbers so you didn't know it was China, the votes in this room for that this country was in serious, serious trouble, not gradually slowing down, not moderate growth, would be overwhelming. So we've got caught in the fact that we can't figure out that even though China is growing much more slowly, even though its debt is rising really, really fast, even though we know it's aging, that somehow everything will be fine. It's not going to be fine unless there's a policy shift. Policy is what determines where China is going, not its history or people's perceptions or desires. China's floor is still reasonable growth for a middle-income country. China can still grow reasonably for a middle-income country, not be on its floor of negligible growth. But, and this is where we may get into more disputes, I don't really see how the macro trend can be disputed, even though people ignore it all the time, but we can argue about policy. I see very slow enhancements to labor mobility. They're happening. They're happening very slowly due to concerns about social stability or whatever. There's no urgency yet. The labor force isn't a problem as it will be in 10, 15 years. But those are opportunities being missed. I think China could make a dramatic step in boosting consumption, wealth for the poorest part of its population, and healthy growth by allowing rural land ownership. This gets talked about a lot, and what we get are measures which are not ownership. And if you ever haven't owned something and you have owned something, they're really different. And someone telling you that you almost own it or you sort of own it doesn't really work very well. So, we're not getting the progress that would cause dramatic change there. On the capital side, the state sector's ability to claim capital must shrink. The state sector has to shrink. This is exactly not what was promised in the 2013 plenary meeting, when what was promised was that the private sector would be allowed to join the state sector in more projects, which is essentially a bailout. That's what we're seeing now. We're seeing you want to, run the Chinese market, there are a lot of large private companies with near monopoly conditions. You give money to China Unicom. You are involved in paying for the reorganization of the state. So we're not seeing less of a drain on capital structurally. Innovation is the hardest call here because people have very, very different views about what constitutes, what drives innovation, and I'm not going to settle them. I'm not going to settle anything here, but I'm certainly not going to settle that. I would pose the following question. If China is trying to get a project, if there's a breakthrough project involved, I like China's chances of getting that breakthrough project. I had a discussion with a set of U.S. people in the intelligence community, and more than one of them suggested that artificial intelligence could be that kind of breakthrough that transforms the economy. I don't know. I'm not an engineer. So I can't address that. If there is a breakthrough, a single area breakthrough that can be managed, I think China has a chance in that sense to innovate its way out of its capital and aging and slow growth problems. But for me, as someone who's ignorant of those kinds of breakthroughs, what I want is innovation across an economy. I want, in a large economy that really, really needs to be more innovative, as the Chinese government is well aware, I want lots of innovations in lots of sectors. I want little innovations. I want big innovations. I don't want to be relying on a single technology or a single sector because China's economy is too large for that. It cannot be driven by a single sector. So let me ask you in that context, if you're looking for the kind of innovation that sustains economic growth in a large economy, do you want it to be commanded by the government with competition in many sectors decreasing, or do you want it to come out of greater individual rights to innovate and more competition? I prefer the latter, and I don't like the Chinese government's approach to this at all. But other people disagree. They think you throw money at R&D and magic will happen. So, back to my premise, Otherwise, for the whole thing, competition is the single biggest driver of prosperity, not the knowledge of the state and anticipating which sectors are important. I have 1 minute. The reason I say it has to be done now is we're going to have a big fight in 2022 over what Xi Jinping's role is going to be. I don't want to get into politics, but I don't think you're going to initiate new economic reforms in 2022. I think it has to be done now. In 2027, China will be well on the way, in addition to whatever its debt problems will be, worse than now, to being an old society. So, I haven't proven to you that it's now or never because that's an exaggeration. But if you look at the Chinese political calendar, if you look at the aging of the economy, if you look at the debt trend, it may boil down to now or never. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this very fascinating speech. And now let's hear to a slightly different view from ELB.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to have the opportunity to tell the story of China's economic miracles. As you know, in recent years, or maybe in recent decades, China has caused a lot of attentions worldwide because some people, some praise its economic miracles, some worry about its sustainability of economic growth. So how to understand China's economic development in the past, currently, and the future. So today I would like to touch upon this issue from three aspects. Number one is what has China been doing over the last several decades? The second is what happened to China? Many people notice that China's economic growth rate have significantly slowing down. But beyond this, what happened to China's economy? And the last issue is how can we see the future development for China? For example, in the next decade, what we can expect from China? So as for number one, I must say, when China initiated its economic reform and opening up policy in the late 1970s, our late paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping, set a blueprint for China's modernization drive in 3 steps. That means, in the first step is we try to solve the hunger and the clothing issue for the people in the 1990s to double the GDP by the end of the 1980s. The second step is to make Chinese people live a moderately prosperous life by the end of the last century. So that means in the last century, we a priority task for Chinese government is to quadruple our GDP. So we have successfully achieved our development goals by the end of last century. So we are in the third stage of our modernization drive. And that means by the middle of this century, China wants to catch up with the moderated advanced economy countries at that time. In the early of this century, the Chinese government, based on the analysis of the changing international situations and the domestic conditions, we made the judgment that we divided the third step of modernization drive into 2 parts. Number one is, by the end of 2020, we will build a moderately prosperous society in all around the way. That means we will continue to double our GDP by 2020 from the 2000. And then, next 30 years, we will make China be better off. And it means in our political science languages, we will to realize the rejuvenation of Chinese nation. So that is also the 200 years development goals set by the Mr. Xi Jinping. That is by the founding of the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China. That means by around 2020, we will achieve our ambitious goal of building a prosperous, moderately prosperous society. And then, when the PRC, People's Republic of China, is to be funded 100, I mean around the middle of this century, we will realize our ambitious goal of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nations. So now we are in a critical stage to fulfill our ambitious goal of the building the moderately prosperous society by 2020. So this is the 13th five-year plan. It's the last 5-year plan for China to achieve this ambitious goal. So this is why we are here. Now, in recent years, what happened to China? Many people noticed that before the financial crisis in 2008, China had sustained double-digit economic growth rate for more than 10 years. But since then, in the last couple of years, the economic growth rate have significantly slowing down, below 7%, around just now around 7%, even below the 7% growth rate. But what has happened to China? I think when President Xi Jinping took power in 2012, the new government or new party leadership made an important judgment that China's economy have entered the so-called new normal with three characteristics. Number one is the growth rate. China's economy is changing gear from high-speed growth to medium to high-speed growth. And number two is we are in the critical stage to transforming our economic structure. So more policy focus will be emphasized. Will be focused on the structural adjustment. And the third feature is in this critical period of the upgradation, and we should place more emphasis on the innovation-driven development strategy. That means to foster new economic-driven forces. Actually, besides the slowing down economic growth rate, China's economy have experienced significant or dramatic changes in its structure. Now, before the financial crisis, investment and export had played a very important role in China's economic growth rate. But now, China's economy have been more service-based and consumer spending driven. As far as up to now, I think according to the China's statistics, the economic growth rate has slowing down from the 10% to below 7% annually. But at the same time, the share of the service sector in GDP have increased to above the 50% of the total GDP. And at the same time, the consumption is making around 64% of contribution to the GDP growth rate. So China actually have almost achieved the rebalancing task over the past several years. And at the same time, we notice that the industrial production is slowing down, but at the same time, the high-tech sectors and the equipment manufacturing sector are continuing their double-digit growth rate over the last several years, which means the industrial structure are upgrading. So a lot of changes during these several years, despite of the slowing down the growth rate. So over the last several years, in order to push forward, sustain China's economic growth rate, the government have placed more attentions on how to enhance the efficiency and quality of economic growth. So more efforts have been made to transform the pattern of growth. So the government proposed the so-called we call the supply side structural reform, which is different from the supply side economics in the 1980s in the United States, because China is still in the second halfway of second pages, in the middle way of the industrialization and urbanization. We still have potential demand from the urbanization in the industrialization. So besides the demand side management, the government have given up its attempts to stimulate the economic growth rate by expansionary fiscal policy and monetary policy. More focus has placed on to enhance the efficiency of the supply system because of upgradation of the consumption demand. So the Chinese manufacturing sector are encouraged to provide a high quality goods and services to satisfy the upgraded consumption demand. So all of this depends on should be achieved through the economic reform. So many people have criticized China have suspended its economic the reform process. I don't think so. Actually, when China's economy enters the new normal, the economic reform or structural reform has become more and more difficult to push forward because a lot of issues are complicated together. And now China took the supply side structural reform as a focal point to push forward the comprehensive economic reform. One is we will continue the market-oriented economic reform, and we try to restructure the SOE in a way that different from maybe in the United States. And at the same time, we also understand that the market not always can play its role in the determination of the resources allocation. So we also emphasize that the government should play its role in the allocation of resources to correct the failure of the market forces. So despite some problems within the Chinese economic development, for example, some people mentioned that the Chinese economic development is credit fueled or driven by debt, and some people think that China's economy could not sustain development, and also we have aging population too rapidly compared with the other countries. So my personal think that in the next 10 years, China will sustain the economic growth rate, but the pace of growth will continue to slowing down because of the economic aggregate become more and more larger, and the aging of population. But the problem is the issue is we will continue our economic growth. I think maybe in the middle, around 6% or 5% in the next 10 years. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Yibao, for this very illuminating presentation. And to round out this panel, Jay will now talk about the financial reckoning of China.
Thanks. Kyle, how do I? There we go. Never mind, I think I got it. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about what China's financial reckoning will look like. And so the title is somewhat deliberately provocative because we're asked to think about the next 10 years in China's macroeconomy. And so I thought this might start conversation in some sense. This question of what's going to happen to China's financial system, I think, is something that gets talked about a lot in policy circles because it is, in some sense, a very big potential unknown sitting out there. Is how will all this sort itself out when you look at what's going on in China's economy? That kind of mentioned already the increase in debt. To be clear, though, I'm using the term reckoning deliberately and not crisis, right? That it may not be a crisis, but something needs to be sorted out. And something needs, in some sense, the accounts need to be settled somehow. And the question is, what will that look like? And that's what I want to talk about today, with a big emphasis on who owes what to whom as an important part of this. So this is the thing that people are talking about when they talk about concerns in China's economy. This is just a picture of total credit to the non-financial sector divided by GDP. And as you can see, starting around the time of the financial crisis, this just starts to spike up at a rate that I think most observers view as unsustainable. And it's not just that they view it as unsustainable, but we've seen this movie before in lots of countries, and it doesn't usually end well. And that's the thing. And that's what people want to figure out then is, so how does it end here? What does this story kind of look like in the end? So if you look around, you see lots of people talk about this. The BIS has warned China's banks risk a crisis within 3 years. S&P cut China's credit rating. Moody's downgraded China for the first time in a long time. And when the IMF last year did their global financial stability report, they kind of outlined 3 or 4 possible big risks out there that could really derail things. And one of them was China could experience a disorderly deleveraging of the credit cycle. And so that's what I want to talk about then, is that what might this look like? So if we think, first of all, one thing to be clear, it's not necessarily the level of credit that is so worrisome. So if you look at the US and China in credit to the non-financial sector, they're actually roughly in the same spot as a share of GDP. China's much higher than most emerging markets, but it's not that you'd say a country can never have credit to GDP at this level. The point, again, is just the very, very, very rapid pace of increase. There's a way you can think about that rate of increase that the Bank of International Settlements uses, which is basically just looking at credit growth relative to a trend and saying, if you're getting far, far out ahead of the trend, then we're going to call that excess credit growth. And if you look in China, you see it start to get quite high at a certain point in time. And then you might say, well, okay, those numbers mean nothing to me. Is 25 a big number or a small number? I don't really know. The answer is, if you look at I think they've got this, they do this for about 44 countries over long periods of time, and only about 17 of them ever got to 25. And if you go through and start looking by hand, most of those cases where a country got to 25, it didn't end well, that there was some sort of bank crisis or bank resettlement that had to take place to deal with this. The IMF recently, in one of I think it was in the Article 4 of China, showed this picture. The red line there is China, and then you can see some other notable growth here. One thing you can see, all the gray lines are the other countries, the very thin gray lines, and you can see China's the highest one right now. That in part though is because Hong Kong is listed in the BIS data, but it's not its own country, and so it's the only place that you actually see this higher right now. And so you've got this situation where credit growth relative to trends are just, in some sense, very unusually high, and in ways that sometimes end badly. Now, it's not historically high, right? You can look at Ireland right before the crisis and right during the crisis, astronomically high compared to where China is. So it's not to say this can't actually end without crisis. It's just that this is something that sometimes turns into crisis. If you look at the literature on credit growth, again, it frequently turns into crisis. An important point, though, is even if there is no crisis, usually there's a big GDP slowdown. And so if you look, though, people often say, well, this is going to lead to a crisis. Actually, in the data, there are a whole range of papers on this. You can get different estimates of how likely a crisis is, but all the point estimates are less than 50%. Right? So it's not that this necessarily ends in a crisis. But as I said, it often then leads to a relatively sharp slowdown in growth. Other people have looked at this. This is some work Goldman did. And again, if you look at, say, 5-year changes in debt to GDP ratios, China is just way out in the distribution in terms of how large this has been. And in work like this, you can, again, go and you see, well, this suggests a fairly large slowdown in growth, as much as, say, 4 percentage points or 5 percentage points. But again, that's the pre-build-up trend growth was around 10%. And so in that sense, if you're moving down 4 percentage points from 10, you're actually basically there already. The other thing that's important is this black line here is kind of the median, and there's an interquartile range around that. And again, you see a very wide range of outcomes, including no negative effect at all. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip that. So why is this difficult to deal with? So different, I think that's from the IMF, different views on this. One of the concerns is that many people have been borrowing and never really been put in a position where they have to kind of feel pain as that borrowing doesn't go well. And similarly, lenders have been able to lend without really having to reckon with the way things go badly. And the same is true for savers who've been investing in products that have risk, but they've been, in some sense, led to believe they're investing in things that don't have risk. And so you've got a lot of people who maybe aren't ready to deal with the fact that some of these financial assets out there aren't good. And again, saving rate is very high. When someone saves, someone has to borrow. That's kind of the point of saving, is someone's borrowing from you. You know, when you build up assets, you're building up liabilities. And so some of these liabilities, the point is, seem like they're unlikely to all be good given how rapidly the level of credit to GDP has gone up. So I think if you look at the potential outcomes, the pessimistic view of this is just a crisis is coming. It's, you know, you can't spike like that without one. I think the semi-pessimistic one is the growth model is going to have to change. You can't keep building just on credit, and it's not sustainable. The less pessimistic is actually, look, the growth has already slowed, and maybe we've actually already seen roughly the impact. The government's view of the downgrades was this is ridiculous, and in particular saying that, look, we have a lot of assets, not just a lot of liabilities, and to think that we're actually going to default on the debt is silly, and so the downgrade that happened made no sense. The reason I think this might not look like a typical financial crisis, though, is the unique role of the government here. And the idea that actually a lot of the borrowers are effectively on the government's balance sheet anyway because they're state-owned enterprises. A lot of the lenders, or the biggest lenders, are in some ways connected to the government's balance sheet because they're banks that have strong connections to the state as well. And because the government has a massive amount of room on its balance sheet. It's got debt to GDP, depending on how you measure it and what you want to include, some estimates in the range of 40 to 45%, where one could very plausibly see that going higher if it had to, right? And so if I'm thinking, again, I actually agree with the government's argument about the downgrade. It has a lot of assets out there too, whether it's equity in the state-owned enterprises, whether it's reserves, it's got assets as well that could be called on to clean things up if need be. And the households really aren't leveraged, right? And so unlike what you've seen in many other countries, it's not the households. And lastly, most of this is local in some sense. So in the sense that it's people within China or firms within China borrowing from others within China. So you don't have the same kind of fear of capital flight in terms of foreign lenders suddenly saying, I want my money back, I'm out. The problem, if you think, well, the government's not that leveraged and neither are the households, someone's got to be leveraged, and it's the corporate sector. And so if you look at credit to non-financial corporations as a share of GDP, the blue line there is China, and you can just see over the last decade that this just spiked quite fast. And that's where that credit to GDP growth is coming from. It's now to the point that it's around 165% of GDP. And this is, I think, where the chief worry is. And so the question is, how do you resolve that kind of leverage in the corporate sector? And it's looking riskier and riskier. This is, again, from the IMF's recent article 4. This is just showing you kind of debt over earnings, and it's getting higher and higher for China. But the point is that's interesting, if you look inside the data, it's not the entire corporate sector that's leveraging. It's the state-owned enterprises. Right? So the green line there is the average leverage of private firms over this period, and it didn't spike at all. In fact, it went down and has been relatively flat. It's the leverage in the state-owned enterprises that have gone up so much. And the data, if you look over this period of the increasing leverage, the SOE's borrowing accounted for the bulk of the increase in leverage, and they have now, they themselves are now quite leveraged. So if you think of this then, so what does that mean? Does this mean you have to have a crisis or not? I think one of the arguments that you'd say you may not have to is if you just took, say, that 60% of GDP kind of spike in corporate leverage, and you said half of that is junk, right? Well, that's 30% of GDP. All right, well, no one wants to have 30% of GDP kind of blow up on you, but if the government had to just shift that onto its balance sheet tomorrow, it could, in some sense. And the thing that does make it easier in some sense is the ultimate borrowers and ultimate lenders are in many ways the same at the ultimate root of it being the government's balance sheet. I'll talk in a second about why that might not be that easy. But again, sometimes when people talk and they say, well, there's no way, I look at the debt to GDP, it's up to 260%. There's no way the government can absorb all that. But the government doesn't need to absorb all that. Not all that is the problem. The point is the growth in leverage can't continue, and there's going to need to be some way to sort all this out. So why not a bad crisis? Maybe. Again, the fundamental issue in a financial crisis is fear. Fear you won't get paid. You don't know who may not pay you. Fear no one you lend to will pay you back. Fear that you may need capital and won't be able to get access to it. You won't be able to get liquidity. And the things that often solve this are either or some combination of information, so you sort out actually who is safe and who's not safe, so you can go back to normal activity, and someone who can clean this up somehow, either by having a balance sheet that they're able to absorb losses on, or that you are able to sort things out and restart a financial system after kind of clearing up a lot of the losses on various balance sheets. And so again, because China's in a position to get everyone in the right room, that could work out. You don't necessarily need to have a currency crisis or run by foreign speculators or a complete panic and freeze on lending. But and this is where I'll conclude, that's in some ways an optimistic take on this, that there's a big mess, and there's a big mess that is something that could be cleaned up without derailing the world economy or anything like that, but it requires difficult political choices. While the government's balance sheet is the ultimate balance sheet behind, say, the state-owned enterprises or some of the state-related banks, at the same time, there are different people who have different responsibilities over different portions of this balance sheet, and that gets messy when you start to then have to shift around who owes what to whom and who has to recognize a loss and admit they have taken a loss. It might be very unpopular to suddenly say to people, oh, we're bailing out these banks or we're bailing out these large firms, and that could make it more politically challenging to do. It could spur capital flight. I think here, frankly, the government has shown the ability to use capital controls when it wants to largely contain that issue. But if things got ugly enough, it's less clear. And the real issue is, I think it may push past the capacity of the state and the institutions of the state to manage this in an expeditious fashion. So I think there is the ability to do so, possibly, but the question is, will they be able to? And one would likely need to expand fiscal policy and especially consumption to replace some of the corporate demand, to prevent having kind of a large slowdown in the real economy at the same time. And if you don't do it quickly enough, then I think you can start to get into these kind of classic financial crisis bank run type fears, in particular in the shadow banking system or in the new asset management companies. If people start to wonder what assets are good and what assets aren't good, who will get paid back and who won't get paid back, that I think is the issue that frankly really needs to be avoided. And the fact that this is stretching on for some, it's been recognized as a big issue out there for a while and really hasn't been dealt with conclusively is one of the things that makes people increasingly worried that it won't be dealt with conclusively. But that's so. I don't have a perfect answer, by the way. The question wasn't rhetorical. I don't know what China's financial reckoning will look like, but it's an interesting thing to think about. So I'll stop there.
Yes. Oh, no, we have until 15 after. It's just that Derek needs to leave potentially in noon.
Okay, so now let's go to the Q&A session. And if you have questions for Derek in particular, let's front load them first because he needs to catch a plane. But otherwise, let's get 3 questions in a row and then answer from there. Okay?
This is not a question for Derek.
That's all right.
This is actually 2 quick questions for Jay. One is, my understanding, based largely on the work of Victor Schur at UCSD, is that a lot of the debt, and the scariest debt, is by these borrowing vehicles formed by local governments. Is that included in your local SOEs, or did you not talk about that at all? And second, there's a lot of experience in dealing with debt crises around the world. Are any of these experiences relevant, in your point of view, for what might happen to China?
So really quickly, I believe, and here's where I'm not an expert on exactly how different people calculate these things differently. My understanding is most of those are going to sit in the SOE category there. It's certainly not on the government. That's not being counted in the government, or at least most of it wouldn't be. On the second question, I think they're relevant, but I think my view here is so that we can't simply extrapolate from prior financial crises and bank crises to think about China, because I think it is just a fundamentally different situation given the extent to which both banks and the biggest borrowers recently and most likely the most problematic borrowers are already state-related in some sense. And I think that is what makes it different. It's something that in some ways provides an opportunity, right? But it also is a challenge. And so I think that's why it's hard to simply extrapolate and say, oh, we know what kind of effects we're going to get, because this does look different.
Over there, any questions for Derek? Yes, please.
All right, Steve Winters. I understand that the central government in China has carried out competitions between the provincial governments, rewarding the heads of provincial governments that do very well economically, and moving them up maybe to Beijing. So that's sort of a state-run competition among provincial governments. Is this a type of competition that you would consider a valid in your image of arguing for competition?
I want commercial competition. I would call that political competition. So no. But to give a more specific answer, something that's discussed a lot by the Chinese and people watching them is, we used to reward provincial leaders for growth, which was a proxy actually for employment. So they would report growth, and if there was nobody on the streets protesting lack of jobs, the reports would be accepted, even though they were usually lies. They need to switch to something else now. Employment is less of a challenge with a shrinking labor force. Environmental issues have clearly become something talked about a lot. We'll have to see at the Party Congress whether there's a pattern of actually dinging people for environmental failures and rewarding them for environmental successes. But I don't think China has a model of what, as my colleague on the panel said, what the new normal economic success looks like for provincial leaders. Like, what does that look like at the provincial level? You can only accomplish so much at the provincial level. You're not responsible for a lot of the decision-making that Jay was talking about. So what does it look like to you be successful economically under the new normal? It's a topic of discussion. I don't think they've worked it out. So even if you think political competition is useful here, we don't have the terms of the political competition being set.
Thank you very much for your comments. I had a question about the implications of what you've been talking about for One Belt, One Road countries. What kind of advice would you give them about opportunities and potential risks given China's domestic development experience?
I'm so glad you asked. I'm sure my colleagues have thoughts about this too, but what they don't have is the China Global Investment Tracker, which is the only public data set on Chinese investment construction around the world, including China doesn't list transaction by transaction, and we do. I do work with the Chinese government on what's useful here. So I have a sense of what's actually happening in One Belt, One Road. And let's say that people start talking about China spending $4 trillion, are going to have to wait a long time for that to happen. I think, what you have in situation, most of these projects, the investments are financed by the Chinese. We've already seen the risk. Jay referred to the imposition of capital controls in response to the capital flight. In the situation of imposition of capital controls, what you thought were the projects may not be the projects. And that applies to One Belt, One Road and outside of One Belt, One Road. Now, in the environment we're in now, where Chinese banks, Chinese engineering companies, Chinese private investors all know that there is a capital control problem for them, I think you can take Chinese commitments as credible. The commitments being made when things are going wild and crazy in the beginning of 2016, those are in jeopardy, and countries relying on those have a problem. But commitments to this point, from this point, I think are credible commitments. I think we will see, if you look at the Belt and Road country pattern, there's much more investment than construction in the US, Australia, Canada, Britain, China's main investment targets. In the Belt and Road countries, there's much more construction. The construction is carried out by state-owned enterprises. The Chinese have stabilized the loss of reserves. I think projects announced going forward in the BRI, at least for a while, are going to be largely construction, largely by state-owned enterprises, and very credible.
Maybe Jiyao, you can also comment on this question.
Well, as for the Belt and Road Initiative, actually, we should understand that since the 2008 global financial crisis, the Chinese enterprises have stepped up the outbound investment. in this context, in 2013, the President Xi Jinping proposed the One Belt and One Road initiative. And when we implemented this initiative, I think the top priority is policy dialogue. The Chinese government have made intensive discussions with the related countries to align our development strategies and make some of the plan or the sign some memorandum about the key project construction. And when we have, the government have some desire or the consensus, so the project can be implemented. The priority is given to the infrastructure interconnectivity and also the promotion of the trade and investment to help the Chinese companies to do business outside. And at the same time, so I think it is very important for the related countries to help them to improve the infrastructure conditions and help their quicken the pace of industrialization. So we emphasize the win-win situation of that. Of course, there are still many people emphasize that it involves a lot of risks, potential risk, political risk, economic risk, and security risk, all of that. So in many places, I think when the Chinese companies come there to make an investment, I think the Western companies would not like to do business there because it involves a lot of that risk of that. We understand quite well, and I think for the Chinese companies, they also understand what they are doing there. But from the perspective, long-term perspectives, it has a potential to help these countries to achieve economic boom, and then they can have some payback to China's investment. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, in the background. Over there.
This morning's post seemed to indicate that North Koreans are working in China, not far from their own border perhaps, in a fish factory. And salmon is produced and is being marketed by Walmart here in the United States, and they say that this is now a federal crime. I wondered what impact this would have on relations between China and the United States. I don't know how they're aware of this, but somehow they are. It could be much bigger than they think, all this, but maybe it's harmless enough. But still, it's a problem. Do you have any recommendations?
Well, as someone who's been in the midst of useless internal administration discussions about these topics, I would actually say North Korea is a positive for U.S.-China trade relations, because there would have been much more pressure for U.S. trade action against China if not for the crisis in North Korea. So I understand your point, that there are particular instances of implementation of new U.S. Sanctions against North Korea. China's not going to have any economic problem deciding to cooperate with those. These are not. It's not like China's earning any hard currency or doesn't have other ways to bankroll North Korea if it wants to. So those are just a question of implementation and good stories about you're eating North Korean salmon and perpetuating genocide or whatever it is that's supposed to be happening. In fact, North Korea has been the main reason why the U.S. has not come to more to blows with China over trade. I guess if you want to take a certain view, the nice thing about North Korea is the problem never goes away. And so it's always going to be a reason for U.S.-China cooperation. See, look, I can find the silver lining in things.
I think we had another question over there. No? Yes.
Thank you. My name is Jeannie Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. My first question was with the One Belt, One Road countries, and you have answered. My second question in that trend is with the peripheral nations of China and all the crisis, all the tensions being raised by China to resolve its domestic crisis. Where do you see it with both Derek and Jay, with the increasing situation inside the country? How would the tension outside be intensified, especially the situation in the South China Sea and the East China Sea? Thank you.
I'll go back to my useless administration discussions to answer this question. This is politics, and I don't work on regional politics, so I'm relying on other people who I've just characterized as useless. So take this answer for what it's worth. There are two ways the U.S. is thinking about how China's going to handle its economic challenges. This is true for any country, including us. You turn inward and you focus on solving your economic problems. I would argue, although there are probably people in the audience who have studied Deng Xiaoping's economic philosophies for years, that is consistent with Deng Xiaoping's approach, and it's consistent with what I think all big countries can do. You have control of your own destiny. Deal with your own economic problems first, and then start considering the world. I wish we would do that here, for example. But the other possibility, of course, is that the party will resort to appealing to nationalism. And that I'm not putting words in Jay's mouth, but if they don't want to take the political choices necessary to deleverage, if they don't want to grant land rights to rural citizens and then boost consumption, if they don't deal with their problems, and you don't have economic growth as the reason for unchallenged party rule, then you need something else. And that is certainly I do not know how to evaluate that risk, but it is a long-term risk that the U.S. government is thinking about.
No, I would actually just echo that, which is that I in no way view myself as an expert on Chinese politics, and so I really couldn't speculate. And I think it's exactly right. It's a political question. One could either pay less attention to everyone around you because you need to clean up something inside, or try to distract people from what's going on inside by your behavior externally. And I wouldn't have the slightest guess which way that would go. I think if things were to end badly, or not end, but were to progress badly, either kind of following along the lines Derek was talking about broadly in the macroeconomy, or if either due to trying to deleverage and it not going well, or trying to clean up the balance sheets and it not going well, I think then that certainly has huge spillovers around the world, because China's the second largest economy in the world, and what happens in China matters a lot to the rest of the world. So I think in that sense, it's going to affect everyone no matter what. And on the other hand, as I said, I think there is a route to clean up the financial system that doesn't end in the way many crises have. And so that could take things in a very different direction.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So shadow banking has been... Thank you. Hello. So shadow banking has been mentioned in your presentations, and just based on some research I did years ago, I just wondered about the fact that, and you mentioned savings, that many Chinese, there's a high savings rate in the country. So based upon the research that I did, I learned that many of the feeder funds are also a result of these savings basically being funneled into them for the government ultimately to use, resulting in the shadow banking as well. But the issue has been a void in robust alternatives for retirement savings, or unlike the United States, where we have, a more robust stock market, et cetera, pensions. What do you think can be done, or should something be done, to offer an alternative to help with curbing that source, basically? Because if you have it and it's continuing and people are looking for these returns, how can you really control it?
Maybe Jay and Jiyao can address this.
I mean, the first thing I would just say is that
Thank you very much.
I think the most important thing, banking is an industry that is prone towards problems. It's and that's why we regulate banking, right? And the whole issue with shadow banking is it is markets that develop to provide bank-like services that are not regulated like banks. And I think the issue in the case here is that there are a lot of people who are putting money into accounts that they think are safe, and the accounts aren't really safe. The products that are then being invested with that aren't really safe. And so either someone is going to have to, there will be losses somewhere. And so either people are suddenly going to find out they're not safe, and that can lead towards a lot of concerns as people suddenly recognize a lack of safety when they thought there was safety. And I think that's where you often find trouble. or someone, the government likely, would have to try to make savers whole and clean things up. So I think that in terms of how do you deal with it, the crucial thing is if people are providing bank-like services, they should be treated like banks and regulated as such. Or if they're not truly providing bank-like services, the people who are doing the investing need to understand that there's risk so that when losses materialize, it's not a crisis.
Okay, I think China's financial system is quite different from the United States. The state-owned banks dominate the financing. The problem is the big banks have low incentives to provide loans to the small and medium enterprises. That's why the central banking business have been developed so rapidly in recent years, but it also involves a lot of the risks. So since this year, the Chinese government, because the Chinese government have placed contain the financial risk as a top priority, so took a series of measures to suppress the development of the central banking. These ones, at the same time, also encourage the regular banks to increase their lending to the small and medium-sized enterprises. But the problem has not been solved. I think this will maybe take a very long time for China to perfect its financial system.
We had a couple of questions on that side.
Thank you. My question is also about the innovation and more about the domestic innovation, because we all know that the Chinese government invested a lot of money into the entrepreneurship and e-commerce and international plus companies, but many of them did not succeed, and it actually affected the substantial economy. So my question is, to what extent do you think that those kind of entrepreneurship can help the Chinese economy to keep growing and upgrade the economic structure?
Well, yeah. Actually, I remember 3 years ago when we were formulating the 13th five-year plan, the Chinese government proposed the so-called new concept of development and placed the innovative development as the priority status of China's economic development. So besides the encouraging entrepreneurship, we also emphasize to increase the R&D investment and encourage the technology advancement and the new products development. Well, because over the last 3 or 4 decades, China's economic development had depended heavily on the input of the labor. But with the rising of the labor cost and the tightening regulation of the environmental protection, as well as the aging of population, in the future, as China's economic growth rate will become more and more dependent on the innovation. So that's why the Chinese government have placed so high priority to encourage innovation. But the problem is that innovation is not easy work. It involves a lot of aspects. For example, how to form the effective incentive mechanism to encourage the engineers, technicians, and the entrepreneurs to make innovation. And we also have to restructure our education system and scientific research supporting system. So I think we have done a lot of that, but the result, we have seen some result, but we still, I think we still should take a very long time to realize our innovation development goals.
I would just actually refer back to the prior comments about the difficulty that small and medium-sized enterprises can face in the capital markets as one of the big challenges with. So I think the short answer is yes, entrepreneurship would be great to help innovation. I think that's true in any country. And I think one of the concerns with what's going on in the financial system now is you see state-owned enterprises had been, in some sense, for a while, actually had been shrinking as a share of the borrowing that was going on, and that really did reverse in the last decade. And so you see much more of the funds channeled towards the large state-owned enterprises. And that makes it harder for smaller enterprises to get capital, in particular if the largest banks aren't doing a good job reaching them, and the financial system outside of that is not as well developed. And so I think that's kind of, the positive side of that is trying to rectify the borrowing by the large state-owned firms and clean up the shadow banking system could reorient funding in a way that helps entrepreneurs. And so that would be great. And that's one other reason it'd be important to do it. But it just also highlights that's one of the challenges that sits there, that it's going to be hard to fund them adequately until some of that reorienting of the financial system is done.
So one or two questions, and then. Here in the front.
Thanks, panelists, for a wonderful conversation. My question is related to one of the slides. I think, Jay, you presented it that the debt issue is mostly concentrated in the state-owned enterprises, right? The household leverage ratio or the non-state-owned enterprises are still pretty low or healthy. So I wonder, could one policy alternative is to allow the household leverage ratio increase to help offsetting, the state enterprise leverage, and if so, what are the policy tools that the government can have?
I think that's interesting. I mean, I think rather than just trying to target it at the household leverage going up, I do think and I think this is an explicit goal of the government, is to increase the spending by the households at the very least and decrease their saving. And so it might not show up as debt because they have so much saving, right? But to decrease their saving rate in some sense. And I think the policies that are often talked about there are a wide range of policies. Some of them involve strengthening the social safety net, so people, in some sense, are doing less self-insurance, whether it's a stronger safety net towards healthcare, towards retirement, or things like that, so that people don't feel the need to save as much and, in fact, can increase consumption and generate more demand domestically, which is obviously one of the major goals of the last few plans. So I think there's certainly room to try to do these things. I think they're hard, right? And I think when growth has slowed, the advice from the IMF or from the US government, and I think, frankly, what is consistent with the goals of the Chinese government is, well, it would be great to increase consumption here, but that's a harder lever to push than let's force some more money out the door in terms of loans towards large firms who we can identify and get it to them. And so if growth is slowing, it's much easier to push that button than try to generate consumption growth. And so I think has been part of the tendency recently to veer away from the long-term goals and channel the money towards the state-owned enterprises. I think it certainly could be done. It's not easy. And so convincing people that they have a strong safety net and they don't need to self-insure, channeling some money. I think the other one would be disgorging more dividends from the state-owned enterprises towards the government and using that for spending, either by the government or channeling it back to households by changing the tax code. So I think there are things you could do in those ways also, but it's certainly part of the solution.
Jiyao, would you like to comment? That's one.
Well, in China, there are also similar discussions. Some people think that we should reduce the leverage of the corporate sector by increase the leverage of the household. But I personally think it's not a good idea because, the current, the so-called low leverage is connected with the stability of the housing markets. Now the Chinese government is taking measures to cooling down the property markets, and also we have taken a lot of the administrative measures, such as restriction on sales and the sales of the houses. So if the housing prices in the future are gradually slowing down, that will create a lot of problems for the leverage for the householders that because currently many people expect that the housing prices will continue to rise or stable, so they can. This is the precondition for their suggestion to increase the leverage of household. But if the current measure to cooling down the property market eventually cause the slowing decrease of the prices of the house prices, there are big problem without that.
Okay, we saw one last question.
Hello, this is a question more for Jiyao. So, as Beijing plans on constructing and developing Xiong, how do you think this will help shape the economic landscape of northern China, which has historically been more industry-based? And do you think Xiong has a chance of turning into another Shenzhen?
It's a very complicated issues. Actually, for the northeast part of China, the old tradition, the industrial basis, and the Chinese government have taken a lot of measures over the last 15 years, try to the increase of, try to change the older industrial bases. I personally think besides the economic system issues or the other, how to say, it depends on the economic cycles. For example, before the financial crisis and during the economic cycles of the larger demand for the upstream industries and the rising prices of the commodities, the north part of China, they lived a better life. But when the price is coming down, there's a lot of problem for them. So the government now, we try to adjust the economic structures, and the government also provide a lot of policy support for the resources-based economy transfer to the innovative economy, but the result is not significant. A lot of discussion in China, and I think the government department have designed a lot of policies, but it's still a problem.
Great. Well, let's give a round of applause for our speakers.